Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And we are on a book club episode today, brought to us by Brazos Press, the publisher for the book we're talking about today, The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. And the author and guest today is Karen Swallow Pryor, Dr. Pryor. We've had her on the show before. She's an excellent writer. We love reading her books and talking to her. This is a fantastic book, and so we're going to be talking about it here in a moment. As always, on these book clubs recently, because we've been around for a few years, we've had a collection of guests that we've had on, and chances are we've had an endorsement from a book that we're going to be covering from a previous guest we've had on. So there's actually 3 guests that we've had on for these endorsements: Mark Knoll, Christopher Watkin, and Jessica Hooten Wilson. So I'm going to pick Jessica Hooten Wilson's endorsement to welcome the audience to this and warm up the conversation. And then I'll go into a little bit more show notes and then we'll get in the conversation. So Jessica Hooten Wilson says this about Dr. Pryor's book: if you think you've read everything on evangelical culture, think twice. The evangelical imagination will blow your mind, as well as encourage your heart to desire what is beautiful again. Pryor's writing is sharp, substantive, and engaging. You will be quoting her to friends and sharing her insights with your family as you struggle to remember the false paradigms you used to live under. With her deep knowledge of the past 300 years of history, literature, and philosophy, Pryor unmasks our assumptions about evangelical culture and shows us both the good and the bad of our inherited social imaginary. You need this book to remind you why you love the evangelical church and to inspire you to be an active culture maker for the kingdom. So if you go to our show notes, Brazos Press link takes you right to this book. And then also just other reminders: if you need to find a church to call home, we have a local church finder link. There's also a link to our website, and then also a link to the website for our Confessional Podcast Network for other like-minded podcasts that we have in our network group. And then just other basic reminders about how to communicate and connect with Peter and myself about the show in general. We are on YouTube, so please subscribe to us. If you're not watching on YouTube right now, please go to YouTube and subscribe to us, because you can actually watch these conversations and maybe get some extra stuff out of it. So I'll let Peter further introduce our repeat guest today, Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to reintroduce to our audience Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. We had her towards the beginning of 2022, so it's exciting to have her on again. She's the author of the award-winning book On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books, which is the last book we actually had her on for in 2022. She's a frequent speaker, a monthly columnist at Religion News Service, and has written for Christianity Today, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, the New York Times, and Vox. She's a contributing editor for Comment, a founding member of the Pelican Project, a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, and a senior fellow at the International Alliance for Christian Education. And she finds time to breathe between those two. So it's a pleasure having you back on the show, Dr. Pryor.
It's great to be back. I'm barely breathing.
That's right. So on that, I thought of my icebreaker question as Nick was as talking. This has to do with breathing, and I see this on your Twitter quite a bit. You run a lot. Is this more like sprinting? Is this like long distance? Do you have like a favorite thing or like a favorite route? So like tell us about Dr. Pryor's running.
Well, I started running in junior high, ran cross country in junior high and high school. So I do like the distance running.
Okay.
I am extremely slow these days. You don't get faster as you get older.
Here's the thing. What is your definition of slow? Because your definition of slow might be different than my definition of slow, which is really slow.
I mean, I know I have a 4-mile loop, a 6-mile loop, and a 7-mile loop.
Okay.
And I usually stop and walk in some of them, so it's sure. Pretty slow. Yeah,
that's what I do. I'm 225 pounds, so getting this big 225-pound CrossFitter on 4 miles is not the funnest thing in the world. So walking is near and dear to my heart in the middle of a run. So I
yes.
Now, my icebreaker question to that is, what is your favorite thing to listen to while running? Because I assume you do listen to
That's
something.
a good question.
That's a really
Our
good question.
podcast,
Okay.
obviously our podcast.
Yeah,
But, you know.
So you don't have to say our pod because that's just assumed. So what's second on the list?
Yeah, that's assumed. So I have two things that I listen to. And it depends, because running I do mainly for my mind,
Okay.
especially as a writer and just
Yep.
needing to process things. Because you don't have to be coordinated or think to run, because I'm not coordinated.
Neither am I.
Yeah, anything to do with balls, like no. I just give me some sneakers in a straight line. So I listen to Audible books, like usually entertaining reads, like suspense novels.
Interesting.
Sometimes literature, but it's harder for me to listen than it is. I'm more of a visual reader.
Yep.
And then, or if I'm working on something that I'm writing, I need to process it, then, and my mind needs a break, then I just listen to music. And my go-to Pandora station for the past several years, because I get a little bit into loops, is my Lumineers channel.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, it's weird to say that's old school, but it's like kind of old school now. I remember listening to that back early college. That's Lumineers is some good stuff. I like that.
It's good stuff, and it's it's definitely old school.
Yeah, which is weird to say because they're like late 2000s, early 2010s, and to call that old school is like that's a little weird. That's just strange.
Well, that's newer than you too, because that was my previous channel.
That's true. Yeah, that's
I'm always behind because I'm old.
Hey, that's us too. We're also old. We're old souls. Maybe not old in years, but old souls. So, beyond just your bio and whatnot, your writing. So tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so my career has been as an English professor. I've taught at Liberty University for 22 years, at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary for 3 years, and now I am transitioning into writing full time, which is exciting and scary and crazy, probably. But and I have been a Christian since I was very young. I even mentioned in the book we're talking about that I don't remember the hour I first believed. I just remember believing all the hours after that, and being baptized about at the age of 7. That's when I really know my moment of faith, I guess. And I live in an old house in Virginia with my husband and dogs, and that's where my home base will be now as I, enter into more writing.
Nice. There we go. I like it. So we've already kind of talked about this book and we've had some fun before, but where did the idea for writing this book come from? And maybe provide, before we kind of get substantive into this, some background for this book.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So like all of my writing, it really emerges directly from my teaching. And because my area of specialty is 18th and 19th century British literature, this is the period, right? I did my dissertation actually on Hannah More, who was a friend of William Wilberforce, one of the one of the early evangelical abolitionists and a writer. And so that is actually when I myself discovered and learned about evangelicalism's history. So that's that goes back a number of years. That's part of the chapter. But then in teaching a lot of Victorian literature, which is in the 19th century, and teaching a lot of that literature to specifically evangelical students who grew up in an evangelical subculture that I didn't grow up in. I grew up in a Christian home, but we just really kind of missed the peak of evangelical subculture. My students just recognized a lot of what we were seeing in Victorian literature, a lot of the values of that time in the literature. And so I just began to ask with them the question, well, what from evangelical subculture is really and truly biblical, and what's just Victorian? And that question just raised so many interesting conversations. I realized I just need to write a book about this.
Awesome. No, it's good. And then to start things off, we like definitions on the front end and basing pretty much off the title of the book. If you ask the average person, they could probably give you a somewhat correct definition of what imagination is. And most people, well, we'll give a lot of credit to people. Most people could probably explain what evangelicalism is. We'll just assume that. We'll just say that for the sake of argument. So, but what about these two separate things put together? Now, what does imagination within evangelicalism mean?
Yeah. No, that's I'm glad you asked this, because this book is really more about the social imaginary, and I'll explain that too. Because and so the two are obviously related. You can tell by the words, but like the evangelical social imaginary just doesn't make for a very catchy title. So what I try to do is to link, our basic understanding of what the imagination is with this bigger philosophical concept that I draw out from Charles Taylor and others. And the asocial imaginary is basically a pool of a community or a society's stories, images, legends, myths, metaphors that lurk beneath the surface, that kind of drive them. They're inherited. They're there often underneath the surface. Taylor calls them precognitive. So we don't necessarily think about them or articulate them, but they actually are forming our desires, our vision for the good life. And we might not even necessarily recognize it. And so there is no one social imaginary, even for any particular group of people, but there are social imaginaries. And so what I try to do is to identify what I think are some of the most prominent metaphor, stories, and images within the evangelical movement for its whole 300 years. Like what drives us, what makes us who we are, for good, for bad. Where did that start out right? Where has it gone wrong? And draw not just from evangelicalism itself, but even the culture that we're part of and formed by, which includes art, literature, painting, songs, commercial jingles, and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe to drive it home a little bit for our audience, and if you can help me with this metaphor, wouldn't be too dissimilar as like a kid going to a house of another kid from a different culture, whatever it is, and then asking, hey, why do you have dinner at this time? Or like, why do you guys do this? And then they tell you, like, well, I don't know. That's what we've always done. But you notice when you're part of a different culture, like, oh, this is different than what I do. But when you're in that culture, you don't necessarily know, why do I do this?
No, exactly. You don't even think about it. So a lot of this has to do with sort of the unexamined assumptions of our.
Yeah, you don't tell somebody, hey, this is why I do it, but because this is the cultural water, air that you breathe or drink, it's what you do. And it's only when somebody from outside of that comes and says, hey, this is different than what I do, then you notice, oh, I do things differently, even if I don't notice it.
Right. And once it comes to your attention, you usually can go back and kind of figure, oh, there's a reason for this. Like even just think of summer vacation from school, something we take for granted. But why do we have summer vacation from school? Well, it started back in the agricultural society when kids were often needed, in the summer and in the fall, and that the change in end dates of school can depend on that. So there are reasons for it, but we don't necessarily think about it once it becomes an established practice.
Totally, yeah, and we'll get into some of this stuff too within evangelicalism. You expose a lot of these things, neither bad nor good sometimes, but just, hey, this is some of the stuff we do, and where does it come from?
Right.
It's kind of like too the other analogy out there. Is that, or metaphor actually, would be that like two fish talking to each other, and one fish asks the other fish, how's the water? And they're like, the other fish is like, what are you talking about?
That's the perfect metaphor. I quote that in the book, right? It comes from David Foster Wallace. It's just that explains it better than anything else can.
Totally.
What water?
In your book, you mentioned a couple things that really are important to understanding what imagination is. And one of them is perception. So you can explain maybe just to connect that definition of why perception is important for speaking about imagination. The other one I hope I pronounce it right, is phenomenology.
Phenomenology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just say it a little fancier than Peter. That's all.
Yeah, he says the French way, the Hegelian
there
way
we
to
go.
say it.
Or
Yeah.
yeah.
I know. I guess the German, because Ulrich Hegel is German, so that's the white way to say it. Yeah, Nick got it.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So, I mean, the way that perception fits in with imagination is that, you know, that we draw in our imaginations, we draw from the things that we perceive. So we draw from, what we see and hear and taste and smell and touch. And if we don't see, taste, hear, taste, I lost track, touch.
All the
senses.
All the senses.
Right, something that we don't perceive through the senses isn't going to become part of our imagination, right? It's very, very simple and basic. But the other part of perception that's important is that part of what forms our imagination over time is what we pay attention to, right? So, I mean, if we're constantly paying attention to divisive, ugly, horrible things, and there are plenty of those things in the world. I'm not saying we should ignore them, but if our attention is constantly drawn to them, then our imaginations are going to take a certain form. I'm not stepping on too many toes here, but conspiracy theories are like one example, right? I mean, they can seem more true and real if you're paying an awful lot of attention to those.
Totally.
Things.
Yep.
Yeah. On the other hand, if you spend a lot of time paying attention to birds and trees and the sun and mountains and the fields, you're just going to have a different imagination. And so that's where phenomenology ties in. So, I mean, the basic, I think, way to talk about phenomenology is to go back to that question. Well, if a tree falls and I don't even know how it goes. If a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, doesn't make a noise, know. So and again, I'm no a cognitive scientist, but it just kind of blows my mind that color doesn't exist in and of itself. Color exists as a
human perception. Yeah.
That's phenomenology, right? And so again, a lot of the things I'm talking about in this book, they have an origin, they have a history, but how they've played out in our evangelical community and in our own lives has so much to do with perception and phenomenology.
Awesome. Yeah. So I have this question in one part. I'm going to actually ask it in two parts. I think this is more helpful. You've already talked a little bit about Charles Taylor's modern social imaginaries. And it's, I guess, not circumstantial, but providential. I just finished reading that book like 2 months ago. And so it's relatively fresh in my mind. So what's kind of the crossover between what Charles Taylor does in modern social imaginaries? Because you don't reference him all that often in this book, but there's a lot of shared capital in both books. Maybe like what's some crossover between what Charles Taylor does kind of in the social landscape and what you do in the evangelical landscape?
Yeah. So, I mean, Charles Taylor is probably better known for his, massive book,
Secular Age,
right? Which I do draw on in this book as well.
Yep.
Right. But what I really needed from modern social imaginaries is just kind of the definition of it, and I think that's primarily what I use. And for me, this being introduced to this concept of a social imaginary was just revolutionary. It changed everything. It's like when I first, and this would be a good point of contrast, I think, for your listeners.
Yeah.
When I first encountered biblical worldview, like it just rocked my world. It changed everything. Like I'm a huge biblical worldview person.
Yep.
I taught, integrating biblical worldview into my subject matter for years and years and years. And yet then I started to encounter phenomenology, James K. A. Smith and his work on, liturgical anthropology, and Charles Taylor. And some things started coming together for me because I would teach biblical worldview. And I'm the kind of person who, if I can figure something out with my head, then that's what I'm going to do. And like that's for me, that's just how I operate. But that's not how everyone operates. And so over the years, I would watch students, be trained in the faith and be discipled and taught, and then stray from it. If not just in belief, even in lifestyle. And I kept wondering, well, what we taught them the right answers. Like, we taught them how to think.
Yeah,
Why is this
They
not
should know
sticking?
better. Why are they moving?
Exactly. And then, but Jamie Smith explains it so clearly by saying, we are desiring creatures before 100%. We are thinking creatures. And I realized, oh, my desire, what I love is thinking. Okay, so that works for me.
Yeah.
But other people have other more driving desires. And so the way that I'm integrating Charles Taylor into this book project is that, taking this, this Augustinian understanding of being driven by desires, and then Charles Taylor's idea of the social imaginaries, kind of being that collective pool of unexamined visions for the good life, unexamined sources of desires, and saying, okay, well, let's at least look at them, because worldview is the rational thinking part. It's the head on a stick part. But social imaginary is beneath the surface. It's like the unexamined assumptions and the precognitive pool of ideas, visions. And so that's what I'm trying to explore in this book, is what's been driving us as evangelicals beneath the surface, before we even really get to worldview.
Yeah. So I want to highlight 3 of these, and I would love to see what you want to highlight too. And I know Nick has a few other ones. We can't cover every chapter in this book. It would take too long. So the 3 that I think are maybe most pervasive in the circles that I run in, I think maybe broader circles, conversion, testimony, and domesticity are the big ones that I think a lot of people think about a lot of often. We don't realize how formed we are by kind of evangelical tradition when we talk about, oh, when were you converted? What's your testimony? Like, share this stuff with us, because it's very different than church fathers, how they talked about the Bible, how they talked about it. Not bad, but like you said, different. So maybe talk about some of these, if you can talk about these 3, and then maybe the one that maybe most stood out to you when you were researching too.
All right, great. It's almost like we had a meeting before this and discussed these questions, which we did not. Okay, so I'll start with conversion and testimony, and even though they're separate chapters, kind of treat them together. Totally. So, and actually, conversion is the best way for me to flesh out that the idea of phenomenology.
That's what I figured. Yeah.
Before. Yeah. So because as you said, church fathers, others throughout church history have thought about conversion differently. They often even use different terms and words. Yeah. So by the time the evangelical revival emerges in the early 18th century, one of its driving motivations was the lack of emphasis on conversion. Because there was a state church, right?
Oh, yeah.
In England, if you were born into a family that, other than being very much a minority on the margins, you were basically assumed to be a Christian, and you're a member of the state church. And then,
so were clergies. Clergies were kind of assumed until they realized they weren't.
They were political appointments. It was just a job. This is what the lack of separation between church and state brought about. And so evangelicalism arose partly and largely to emphasize the need for individual conversion, which is great. I'm all
absolutely. Yeah, you need to be converted. There's no question about it.
Exactly. But what happens when that gets distorted, as I think we have in contemporary American evangelicalism, is we have such an emphasis on conversion that we focus too much on the number of hands raised, the number of cards filled out, the number of people, someone to pray that sinner's prayer with you, a stranger, and then walking away, and and
whoever walks up to the altar during the altar call, who does all this stuff,
exactly.
who raises their hand the highest during the praise chorus.
Yes, and again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with those things, but what we have to look at is, why are they so important, and are we neglecting anything else in doing that? Are we emphasizing quantity over quality of discipleship and evangelism? And then along with that, I treat it as a separate chapter, but is this idea of testimony, which is very phenomenological in the sense that most of us have in contemporary evangelicalism have this idea, and unless we really think about it, we don't even know it's an idea, but we have this idea that a dramatic testimony is better and more valuable, right? And so if we
and your
don't have
testimony
one,
gets more dramatic the longer that you live. You're like, oh, all this crazy stuff happened. When you first said it, I was like, oh yeah, this happened. But you hear everybody else's testimony.
Yeah.
Like,
And
maybe
so
I have to up my
you
game.
reinterpret your own experience kind of according to that. And if you don't have a dramatic testimony, or if, like me, as I mentioned earlier, you can't even remember the day you were saved because
Which
you
is
were
my
so
wife.
little.
Yeah, my wife grew up and she doesn't know a day or time that she was converted, but she always felt bad. I can't think of it. Everybody else knows this stuff. I don't know this. Why don't I know this?
That's phenomenology. There's no reason why she should feel bad, except for we live in this culture that emphasizes testimony in this way. And so again, conversion is essential. Testimony is powerful, but we're
not saying conversion's bad. We're saying conversion's great, but the sole emphasis on the personal experience.
Exactly. And so again, so these two chapters just exemplify what I'm trying to do in the book, is say, hey, how did this start? Why is it here? What's biblical about it? And where does it maybe get distorted or go off the rails, or what are we leaving out when we emphasize things? Now, the third chapter that you wanted me to talk about actually answers the next question. You asked me kind of like which chapter was I most excited about, I guess. Or
I figured as much. I was trying to get into the prior brain with that one.
Yeah, you did. And interesting, I mean, everybody's talking about masculinity and femininity.
That's the hot topic right
now.
Yep.
Gender roles right now, which is a perfect example of what I'm talking about in this book, like overemphasizing something that may, be rooted in truth and be an important truth, but wrapping it so much into a cultural context actually can damage or distort the truth that underlay it. And so I didn't want a chapter on masculinity and femininity. Everyone's talking about that. I didn't want to be part of that. But what happened during the Victorian age that the evangelicalism had a great role in is the establishment of the domestic sphere. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Part of it, a big part is the Industrial Revolution. Work got messy and dirty and depersonalized and dehumanized for a lot of people, which made home life even more important. And funny story I'll share about the writing of this. I don't know if it's funny. Maybe it's just like touching and personal. But when I was writing this chapter, an earlier draft that I gave to one of my most trusted readers who knows me well, was kind of looking down on the domestic sphere because obviously I'm not a big fan of relegating women entirely to the domestic sphere, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Cards on table. I'm a professional with a PhD who's, had a special life for a long time.
Yeah. It shouldn't come as a shock that this is
right. But my friend who read this said very honestly and helpfully, Karen, this chapter doesn't reflect the person I know. Because you love your home life.
Interesting.
And I looked at it and I said, you're right. And so I revised it. And so the end of the chapter, I mean, it's completely changed because, I don't want to just give the whole chapter, but, so, I mean, I do find the positive and the negative in the role that evangelicalism played in developing the domestic sphere and also in actually giving women more agency. A lot of people don't know that story, and I include that story. But I kind of just home in on how important the domestic sphere is, not just to evangelicalism, but really within the Protestant faith. Because as Protestants who said, nothing is secular, or that there's no division between secular and sacred. And you don't have to go to church, and be and receive the sacred from a priest. You can actually, your home can be a sacred space too. And so that's kind of how I end up with that chapter.
Awesome. Yeah, that's good.
And you state this in the book that this isn't a historical book, obviously, but it is.
It's not dehistoricized, but it's not a historical book like proper.
Yep. But it's always helpful. My ears always perk up when I guess metaphorically when I'm reading when there's some historical background that's that's explained. I think people like that because it answers some questions like, how did we get here? You know, what some foundational stuff. So you did hint at the Victorian era, but for background, why are the results of the Victorian and Enlightenment time periods you mentioned in the beginning of the book so significant for what we're talking about?
That's a really good question. So speaking in like even broader sweeps, I mean, I think most listeners are familiar with, you know, sort of like the pre-modern, modern, and what we might call postmodern or late modern. I mean, we are, you know, squarely in modernity, even if it's late modernity or, you know, or a little bit post, depending on who you talk to. And evangelicalism is very much a product of modernity. It's a product of the Enlightenment because of its emphasis on, you know, individual conversion, as we talked about, individual relationship with Jesus, individual experience. And, you know, I think all those things are crucial and important. I think that's, you know, the Bible says you know, that we do have to have these personal individual experiences and relationships, and we have individual souls that either, you know, are, you know, converted or not. And so there's an element of modernity that goes right along with these main ideas of evangelicalism. And yet, just as modernity has its excesses and its blind spots and its distortions, so evangelicalism has those too. So some of the later chapters, such as the one on improvement and materiality and sentimentality, those are not things that just characterize evangelicals. They characterize modernity.
Oh yeah.
And here we are. We're moderns as much as we are evangelicals, and recognizing that, I think, is what we need to do in order to separate the cultural from the biblical. Not that we can ever separate ourselves from culture, but we can just at least recognize the
distinguish. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that brings me to this, because in case our audience didn't know, you like books, and that's a big part of your background, and people know that. People know we love books. You got deep, and what I love too is you have vast taste. It's not just kind of one lane. You move throughout different lanes. You've taught English literature for decades, written books, edited classics. So building off of Nick's last question, you've somewhat delving into this, but I want to really kind of zero in on this. This is big. 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and like the literature, like literary output from this time period, and how that's affected or been infected or opposed Christian truths of various sorts. And I don't mean literature that's Christian per se, but either embedded within Christian assumptions or questioning Christian assumptions. What, maybe talk about, I mean, that was a huge, broad question, but some of the kind of like the literary play with Christian truths and Christian assumptions.
Yeah, no, again, this goes back to evangelicalism being part of the modern age, right? Because, you know, we all know that without the printing press, there would not have been a Reformation, at least as we know it. I mean,
nor personal Bibles,
nor Bibles that existed that we could actually also read.
Nor your book, which we can read now too.
Right. So this changed everything, and also changed our understanding of, you know, what the Christian faith looks like, feels like, and is lived out like. Now, I happen to think that, you know, that this is you know, that all this was part of God's plan. I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
You know, we are people of the book, even before there was a printing press. Jesus is called
people of the scroll.
Yep. Yeah, even before there were printed words. Yeah. And so having the Bible available, having widespread literacy, having the technology to produce a lot of reading material, and eventually novels, my favorite.
Yeah.
You know, that's what really birthed, you know, to use another philosophical term, modern subjectivity. This idea that, you know, we are our own moral agents. We can determine our destiny. I mean, there's a way of understanding that even within a Christian framework, right? It's me and God, but also it's not me and, you know, whatever station I was born into, or, you know, I don't have to be whatever my parents were. I mean, this is the whole entire project of modernity. And so even the way we understand Christianity and express it and live it out is informed by the way that reading and books and just the way that cultivates our own sense of inner subjectivity, and also offers us visions beyond ourselves and our limited, physical environment. That changes the way we understand our faith as well. There's so much I could say about that.
Oh yeah, totally.
So I'm really just giving a little bit of a snippet, but I do want to point out that the earliest novels, such as, and I talk about this in the book, is, for example, it's not really a novel, but it's a pre-novel, is Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah.
Great classic work of literature that is actually changing the way we understand faith, because of the way he narrates his, not just his adventures, but his actual conversion experience, and then how he lives that out. And it's tied completely and directly to the idea of, of empire, sort of being the empire of our own domain. I talk about it more in the book. It's a lot, but early novels built a lot of those ideas into us.
Yeah, and bridging into the next question, I think this will help too. Maybe talking not about the negative, but the opposing aspect. How a lot of literature, 1800s, who grew up in Christian households, who grew up within maybe strict evangelicalism or pious evangelicalism, whatever you want to call it, or pious Lutheranism, more subjective Christian experience. When they wrote kind of against or questioning some of those evangelical assumptions. Can you maybe talk a little bit about those who wrote, not attacking Christian truths, but like kind of questioning how that kind of helped those who started questioning more of these kind of assumptions that Christian held to?
Yeah, well, there was a whole generation of the children of the first Victorians who, the first Victorians tended to be more Christian, whether just in name only, but embodied Christian values and ideas, especially evangelical ones. And surprise, lo and behold, their kids rejected that, right? This happens now. So they wrote, sort of vast bodies of literature, expressing certain varying degrees of rejection of the faith, and a lot of that is tied into the emergence of modernism as a literary and artistic movement, which coincided with World War I. But all that to say, I think the most important thing for us today is to realize that what we're seeing now in digital media, deconstruction, evangelicals, empty the pews. These are real and raw experiences and responses to real and harmful events many times in the church. But at the same time, it's not new.
No, not at all. Yeah.
And we have a different technology, the printing press. We had lived in a print culture for 500 years. We're now living in a digital age, and being able to communicate with one another and find communities that are like-minded, for good or bad, is always going to have an effect. And I want to say, I hope this isn't too daring or too overconfident, but I think that my book, along with some others that are coming out right around this time, are maybe offering a little bit more of a middle way.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of naive embracing, myself included, of everything evangelicalism stood for.
Same here. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we've seen a lot of deconstructors and leaders of church and everything. And it's my hope and prayer that this book and some others along these lines are saying, let's save the baby and get rid of the bathwater. Which is not easy. But I'm hoping it offers a way forward that's like that.
Yeah, you're exposing assumptions that are more cultural in flavors. Like, hey, let's question some of these things, not the core of the faith, but some of the stuff we've adorned the faith with and assumed the faith comes with. And to say you're a Christian means you're this or means you're that, versus saying I'm a Christian, and our kind of cultural expressions may vary in some way, shape, or form. But what a lot of these kind of deconstructors early on did, which people are kind of now experiencing again, is just saying, no, this has been so tied together that I'm going to reject this, and it means I have to reject the faith as well. And you're saying, hold on, that's like there is an evangelical message, there's an evangelical assumption that maybe we have to shed some of these assumptions we haven't really thought about before.
And that's exactly right. And I want to emphasize this point because it's so important. And again, I am speaking as someone who has taught generations of young evangelicals.
Totally.
So I say this because I've seen it. It is so, we can never escape culture.
No.
I said that before. Like, and I love culture.
We're not going to be Christians outside. Like, we can't strip Christianity from culture. Right.
So there is nothing wrong with saying, hey, in this community or this congregation or in this culture, we do things this way just because, this is who we are or how we like it. But when we say something is Christian, when it is cultural, and then young people or anyone find out, no, this is not what Christianity is. It is just cultural. That's when they start to think everything is a lie.
Yeah, totally.
That is doing more harm than anything else that I know of in this age. So
yeah, and your book tries to expose what are we assuming is Christian that might actually be cultural.
Right. And it might be good. It might be good. It might be bad.
Totally, yeah.
We just have to make that distinction and not say, not give the name of Christ to something that's just human.
Yeah. It's not saying if it's cultural, it's wrong. It's just, okay, what, like, now that you know it is cultural, how does it agree with what we see in the word?
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah. So much of cultural could be subjective too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly. Or phenomenological.
There we go.
Like it.
Absolutely.
I want to provide a compliment that leads into a question. I'm sure you're totally okay with that, right?
Oh,
yeah. She's like, just keep them coming. Yeah.
So we said this before we aired is there's so many great theologians out there, but not all of them. Not all of them are excellent writers, and there's great content. You can learn a lot, but there's something that
like information download dump versus like, oh, it's conveyed in a beautiful way.
But something unique to you is, I mean, you love literature, you read broadly, you understand, you understand stories and how to make connections through just enjoyable reading, by making connections to theological themes. So I think you would agree with what I was saying there. But that I say that compliment to lead into this next question about, go into the subtitle of your book, how stories, images, and metaphors created a culture in crisis. But you do talk, this is more anecdotal, so there's more examples in the book, but you talk about, I wanted to touch on the Canterbury Tales. And because you start off one of your chapters with that, so there has to be a purpose. And it helps you explain why we need another Reformation. This time maybe against the evangelical institutions. And just for you guys that are new, the First Reformation mainly against the Roman Catholic Church. So how does your reference to the Canterbury Tales help you explain this?
Oh, no one's asked me this question yet. Wow. Thank you. So I have taught portions of the Canterbury Tales for like more than 20 years, usually to, freshmen or sophomores. And I always teach the Pardoner's Tale, which is a tale told by, it is a beautiful moral tale told by a very corrupt person. And so when I'm, sort of explaining the historical background to my students and how, during this time, there were a lot of crooks and swindlers who would sell like relics, like a sheep bone. They would call them magical, or say that, become poor, or you give more money, I'll be forgiven for sins. All these different sales that were going on, whether of indulgences or actual, things that were supposed to have magical powers. It's really hard. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around how people could have thought this was true. And it's hard for my students to think about relics and indulgences in this way. And yet I find myself now, all these years later, realizing, wait a minute, I've bought a few relics.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like I sought some indulgences.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not any different from these medieval peasants.
No.
And maybe the church is in another place where we need this new reformation, at least a reckoning. And this is, for me, this is why I love literature so much, because it broadens my perspective and understanding to help me know there is nothing new under the sun. People have been through this before. They've seen these same things before. We might have a new iteration of it that's new to us, but it just grounds me and gives me more hope, in the sense that things aren't that different. But we're still accountable. We still need to learn these lessons, and they're there for us. But I just thought I actually rewrote that whole chapter too at one point, at least the beginning. And I just really thought that story from medieval literature just before the Reformation, because Chaucer was actually, I think through his literature, he helped open people's eyes to the need of a Reformation.
Oh, big time,
before Luther, the theologian, came along. So we've got the storyteller preparing the ground for the theology.
Yeah, there's if somebody's never read the Canterbury Tales, maybe you've never heard this, but there is one aspect of the Canterbury Tales that has a pretty direct relation to my middle school years, and it's all the fart jokes that are in it.
The Miller's Tale. Yes.
It is astounding how many fart jokes are in that book. Reading this, like, this brings me back. People.
They're so earthy.
I was like, oh man, they're 700 years before me, but they're not that different than me. It's
and actually, since you brought this up, so it's a lot of my students and even general readers. We have this myth, this illusion, this story that we've gotten more and more sort of loose, for lack of a better term, as time goes on. But actually, during Chaucer's time and Shakespeare's time, there's a lot of body, stuff, literature, earthy stuff, and it was the Victorian age where we saw, in excess,
refinement,
and refinement, right? So just like it's not like a straight line up or down; it's really more like ups and downs in terms of our morality and our comfort with our bodies and our prudishness and all of those things. And give me Chaucer any day.
That's right. Exactly. His Old English is kind of hard for me to get through. I got to get through modernized stuff. But yeah, totally. And what you said too about the relics, we can kind of poo-poo people who talk about relics and indulgences. We evangelicals have it. We just call it a different name. Like you talk about like our private Bible time is somewhat of an indulgence. Our private prayer time is somewhat of we may call it differently, and we may look at Roman Catholics like, oh, you guys are idol worshipers and we don't do that stuff. And then we realize, oh, if you look through our assumptions, we actually kind of do that same stuff that they do as well.
Absolutely.
So cool. So that's last question, landing this plane. My guess, both Nick and I's guess, is when somebody looks at the cover of the book, they might assume that it's just a critique on the evangelical church, evangelical mind, where you're saying, okay, here's all the wrong stuff that evangelicals think. Let's think better. They're insufficiently critical of their own assumptions. They don't really think about what they think. We got to kind of scrap this project, start anew. But what is your hope for people who read this book?
My hope is that I will just introduce to readers the idea of doing what we just talked about, kind of separating out the cultural from the biblical, because there's so many more examples that I didn't even scratch the surface. Yep. And so I hope that they will be. It's definitely a more critical book. I'm a critical person.
That's not just critical.
Right. The hope, the desire, the need is to find our way to a more biblical expression of our faith, and ultimately really just get past all of the cultural stuff to see and know Jesus, who is, he became human, he lived in culture, and he is our model for the way forward.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Pryor, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your writing. Thank you for all that you've done for the Evangelical Church for those who are reading and try to figure out how do they navigate culture and Christianity. Thank you so much for writing this, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me again.